$50 million lost on Aave, a huge loss for one user. I'm going to explain why that happened and who is in a way responsible for that loss. There's quite a lot to say about this. There's been a lot of news around Aave lately. I'm going to stay factual, really lay out what happened and then give you my opinion. We're going to talk about that and a lot of other topics as well. We're going to talk about companies buying cryptocurrencies and raising funds. We'll talk about BlackRock launching its Ether staking ETF. I'm going to talk about Pi, and we're also going to talk about the United States, the politics in the United States. So yeah, hello everyone and welcome to Crypto Red, the crypto news channel. Let's start quickly with crypto prices. The market is up today. BTC around $72,000, Ether around $2,100. So yeah, basically almost everything is up today. And just no, you know what? Let's start with Aave. What's happening around Aave right now is pretty incredible. I've been talking about it for a while. It's all started a few weeks ago, really a few months ago. I'll come back to the history in a moment, but first I want to talk about the issue Aave has just had that involved a user who lost $50 million on the app. What happened is that the user wanted to make a swap, because on Aave you can do swaps. You can see it here. There's a small swap widget that lets you swap tokens directly. It makes it easy to swap collateral and so on right inside Aave. That widget was used by this person to convert $50 million worth of USDT, of Aave USDT. It's USDT deposited on Aave. He wanted to turn it into Aave tokens deposited on Aave. So the user made the swap, and that swap returned only $36,000. So clearly there was a mistake. From what we can tell, the user didn't pay enough attention. For example, right now, if I use the swap widget and try to swap $10 billion into other tokens, it does show a warning. It clearly says I would get minus 100%. I imagine that if I actually had the funds, I'd get an even stronger warning. Apparently, there was also a checkbox to confirm the action, but in the end, the user seems not to have paid enough attention and went through with the swap anyway. That swap was executed through CoSwap. And what's actually quite striking and a bit ironic is that the whole collapse in sentiment around Aave, all the controversy, all the bad buzz, was originally caused by the swap widget. Everything started when Aave Labs decided to change the provider behind the swap widget. The previous provider was ParaSwap, and they replaced it with CoSwap. When that change happened, ParaSwap had been sending a certain shares of fees back to the Aave DAO, but when Aave Labs switched to CoSwap, instead of continuing to send those funds to the Aave DAO, they kept the funds for themselves. That's how the first controversy started. And that's how, through snowball effects, we ended up where we are now, ACI leaving the DAO, BGD Labs leaving the DAO, as well as Aave Labs basically coming back alone to take control of Aave. So it all started there, and it's still continuing. And now, once again, we've got more bad buzz, more negative headlines around Aave. And once again, it's being caused by this CoSwap widget. There are platforms that are more careful about this kind of things. And I always recommend that people who want to do swaps use LlamaSwap from DeFi Llama. In fact, according to the founder of DeFi Llama, this kind of swap would not have gone through on DeFi Llama. On Aave, that protection wasn't there. CoSwap said this was not a bug. They said it wasn't something technical, some technical malfunction or user error, but they also said they were going to improve protection for users by adding stronger warnings. And clearly there is a problem when it comes to warning. It's very easy to protect yourself legally by saying, well, there was a checkbox. But how many people check boxes without really reading everything? A lot of people do that. Sometimes you want to move quickly, and when you do that, the result can be catastrophic. We even got an explanation from Stani, the founder of Aave, who said that the user made this swap from a mobile phone. So yes, this happened from a smartphone. He had something like $50 million on his phone, and he made the quick swap on Aave without paying close enough attention. Maybe he was doing something else at the same time. Again, he was on his phone. Maybe he was at the beach drinking a cocktail, casually swapping $50 million in one click without really looking at the warning. Apparently, something along those lines is what happened. They said they were going to refund Aave. They said they were going to refund part of the fees, but honestly, that's negligible. We're talking about $600,000 in fees being returned to the person who made the swap. There are a few more interesting things about the person who lost the fund. Did you know that the person has $400 million on chain? So I don't know who this is, but it's clearly a whale. I really hope it's not an institution. If they had $50 million sitting on a mobile phone like that, I don't believe it's probably more some extremely rich people in crypto. In any case, they still have, like I said, $400 million. So don't worry too much for them, but still losing $50 million has to hurt. And the slightly worrying parts. Look at this. Mark Zeller revealed this. He showed the screenshots from Aave CTO Emilio posting a message saying something along those lines that, well, there was a checkbox saying I'm not retarded, and he checked it. And that's a bit questionable. Let's say because he's mocking someone who was trying to buy $50 million worth of your token. That's what Mark says. And of course, he doesn't stop there, Mark, because he criticized Aave a lot now that he left. He said that up until now, they had been very careful not to introduce things that could hurt the user, meaning they try to protect people from their own mistakes. And that's why he says if you try to remove collateral on Aave to the point where it would immediately get you liquidated, they stop the transaction and block it. Those are exactly the kinds of protection that are good because they protect users from themselves. In crypto, people make a lot of mistakes. So you have to try to design things in a way that reduce the number of mistakes user can make. That also was the whole point of DeFi, the whole current movement of DeFi around better user interface improvement. And what Mark Zeller is basically saying is that you have to be extremely careful when designing products. And now that Aave Labs is controlling Aave almost alone, well, they seem to have a different mindset. And because of that, we may end up seeing more situations like this. Again, this is not a hack. I really hope Aave Labs is going to pay more attention now and prevent this kind of mistakes from happening. This is really important because people can lose confidence in Aave when they see a lot of news like this. So yeah, that's what's basically happened with Aave. So whose fault is it? It's the user fault, yes, but it's also the fault of Aave Labs and CoSwap for not putting strong enough warnings in place. And I really think they should have blocked this kind of swap past a certain percentage, for example. So, and just to be clear, this is not a slippage issue. Slippage is how much deviation from the expected price you're willing to accept. Here, the real problem is that the quoted trade itself, the expected price itself was bad and the user accepted it. So the person that approved and signed the transaction for what was basically a code that was way below what they initially wanted to swap. So yeah, this is another reminder that DeFi is amazing, but you can make mistakes. Things can happen. Bugs can go unchecked or checked, and you really have to be careful when you're using DeFi. And yeah, I didn't tell you who actually benefited from all this, who made the money. $34 million was captured by Titan Builder. That's an Ethereum block builder. Those are specialized entities involved in block construction on Ethereum. In short, they're very, very specialized players and are the ones who end up taking the vast majority of the funds. Next, more than $10 million was taken by an MEV researcher who also takes part in arbitrage and things like that. They rebalance the pools after the trades, for example. So it wasn't Aave that took the $50 million. It was external entities, and they probably won't reimburse the hacker. Sorry, not the hacker, the person who lost the money. And Aave doesn't really have the ability to step in and reimburse that person anyway. $50 million is too much for them. And they can't possibly reimburse that. So there you go. That's what I wanted to share about Aave. But next, let's talk about BlackRock. BlackRock launched its Stake Ether ETF yesterday. This was something a lot of people have been waiting for. The ticker is ETHP. They launched it with $100 million in assets, and it saw $50 million in volume on day one, which is actually pretty solid. And from a yield perspective, it's also interesting to talk about the return attached to it. The net yield of the ETF is around 1.6%. So that's well below the 2.8 or 2.6% that you can get by default on DeFi by staking yourself. But why? It's because the ETF takes a 0.25% fee, just like BlackRock, classic ETF. And on top of that, they take 80% of the staking rewards as fees. So basically, on the yield itself, they take 18%. And also, there's only 80% of the Ether that is staked. They could potentially go up to 90%, but for now, it's only 80%. So when you pull all of that, you get roughly 1.6% net yield. Grayscale also has a competing staked Ether funds, but they stake much less. They're closer to 60% of the Ether being staked. So even if the fees are lower, the end result is still a bit less. Still a bit less than the 1.6%. So yeah, that gives you an idea of the kind of yield you can get from Ether ETFs in the United States. There are other ETFs coming soon. VanEck is preparing a staked Ether ETF and a Lido staked Ether ETF, and they will be able to stake the whole thing because it's with Lido, which would obviously be a good thing. We'll have to see what the fees look like, but it could end up being more attractive from a yield standpoint. So really, even the ETF world is starting to realize that there's yield to be earned in crypto, in staking and so on. They're starting to offer those kind of products. And I think that's a very good thing because it allows your money to actually work for you, especially for ETFs holders who, in my view, are usually thinking very long term. This can really allow them to make an extra 10%, 20%, 30% over several years on the capital they've invested. I'm not talking about 30% per year, of course. I mean, over time. Next, let's talk about 8Co. It's a company that has existed for a long time, but it was recently rebranded. And the goal of 8Co is to accumulate WorldCoin tokens. In fact, they've accumulated 10% of all WorldCoin tokens currently in circulation, which is around $100 million. And the latest news is that they raised $125 million to make other investments. They've already announced that they've invested $50 million in OpenAI, $25 million in Beast Industries, you know, Mr. Beast's company, the YouTuber. And by the way, they raised money from Bitmine in particular. So Bitmine, who is a company that raised money to buy Ether, but also to buy other stuff. I think it was a bit strange for them to raise money from 8Co from Bitmine the first time because Bitmine's goal was to raise money to buy Ether, but now it kind of changed with this. Their justification was basically that they want to grow the money and then reinvest in Ether later on. So yeah, fine, but still. Anyway, the point is I went to look at 8Co valuation and it's around $178 million, which actually isn't that high because they already have $100 million in WorldCoin, $22 million in Ether, $50 million in OpenAI exposure, and $25 million in Beast Industries. So they're already above the $170 million in assets. That means the company is trading below the value of the assets it holds. There's basically a discount. But what's very clear is that if WorldCoin explodes and the price explodes, it will obviously have a massive impact on the stock price because their exposure is huge. As far as I know, it's the company with the biggest concentration in a single cryptocurrency. I mean, I don't know of any other company that holds more than 10% of single crypto. Strategy and Bitmine hold around 3% of Ether or BTC. That's still nowhere 10%. Even in Solana, I don't think there is a company holding 10% of all Sol, but there's one holding 10% of all WorldCoins token. Then we have the Pi token, which jump around 30% on the back of news announcement because Kraken said Pi is going to be listed on Kraken. So that just came out. Personally, I'm not a fan of Pi. I've told you that for a long time. I keep seeing it everywhere. They talk about mining, even though it's not really mining. It's more like, well, I'm not going to call it a Ponzi, but it's basically a giant referral network where you have to click on your phone as often as regularly as possible, at least once. I believe it was once a day last time I checked. So yeah, I'm really not a big fan of the product, but it still has a market cap of more than $2 billion, which is huge. To me, it's entirely supported by the community because there are so many people involved in Pi. And I think that's what explains why the price is still holding at such high levels. And yeah, and finally, I wanted to talk about the Clarity Act in the United States. According to one of Senate leaders, it probably won't happen before April. The Clarity Act is being pushed back because the priority, in line with what Donald Trump asked for, is the Save America Act, which is meant to put identity verification in place and require proof of US citizenship before someone can vote. So that's going to be prioritized first, and later on we'll get the Clarity Act, which is supposed to bring a clearer regulatory framework for crypto. The status of yield and stablecoin also needs to be clarified. The CFTC is also expected to get more power. So all of that is coming, just not immediately. Hopefully it will happen at some point during 2026. That's what I wanted to cover on the different crypto news today. Take care and see you on Monday. Bye-bye.